Good evening, folks. I am here with Billy Elverton. You want to say hello, Billy?
Hey folks, quick.
It is about 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and we're here to talk about the next climate phase. In light of some recent news that has come out from somebody who has been talking about climate change for quite a while and has had their hands in this climate stuff for even longer. Some quick little background on those who are unfamiliar with the climate change position that we share with some other fairly prominent scientists. One, the climate is changing, no doubt about it. Two, human pollution presents a plethora of issues, and there's something that needs to be done to stop the way that we waste and we poison the planet. No doubt about that. However, as Richard Toll, lead author at the IPCC, and as the head of the IPCC, Dr. Pachauri, have admitted, we are now, as of November 20th, 2014, going on 2 decades without any substantial global warming. In fact, many parts of the planet have been cooling, and if you take our high point back from the 1998 El Nino event, we have actually cooled as a planet. And so there's a lot of question about what's coming. Is this just a pause in global warming? The folks who got it wrong for the last 20 years have come up with now more than 40 excuses as to why their models were wrong, things they've missed. But perhaps we should be looking for something other than modeling. Perhaps we should be looking at some things we can actually observe, looking back through the past, see what kinds of hints we can get, because the thing with climate modeling, it's like trying to model the entire universe. Remember, they tried to model the entire universe, missed 97% of it, and invented dark matter and dark energy. Well, if you don't have all of the inputs, or you haven't properly characterized all of the inputs, it's going to be nearly impossible to have anything close to a representative study or mathematical model. And so that's likely what we've seen here over the last 20 years is a mathematical model that is very nice, and these folks have worked very hard on it, but the problem is they have essentially written the sun out of climate change. And this is what we've been talking about for quite some time. We'll have a link for you guys to our climate change playlist, which pretty much covers the last couple of years of this, every in and out, in pretty much any way that you can want to see it. But we're going to start with the recent news that got us going in this, and I'm going to try to screen share here my desktop. This has, we've had some troubles with this in the past, so we'll hope it works. Okay. Billy, do you have any idea if my screen share is working now?
I'm going to look on your channel. It's working on my end of the Google Hangout.
Okay. Well, we'll hope it's working on everybody else's end. And Billy, if you could check that out, and feel free to interrupt me if for some reason it's not working. What I'm looking at right now is an article from 4 days ago called Climatologist, 30-year cold spell strikes Earth. And what this is about John Casey, who, if I can quickly tell you a little bit about John Casey, and this is from spaceandscience.net. John Casey is the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation. He's been a consultant to NASA, former White House space program advisor. He was a space shuttle engineer. He's one of the most prominent climate change researchers and climate prediction experts. And for a few years now, he has been hitting at this idea that this is largely driven by the sun. Not to say that humans don't have any effect on the climate. That would be ludicrous. We are an input into this larger system, and every input into a system affects the outcome. But as for the question is why, when CO2 has been skyrocketing faster and higher than in the history of human involvement with this planet, why have we seen this ridiculous global warming pause and even a bit of cooling? And the answer would be the sun. When we bounce back to this article real fast, and I'll give you a picture of John Casey right there. Billy, you've been doing a lot of research on John Casey and some of the things that he's been talking about, and the observers watching right now are going to be doing a little bit of smiling during this because they may have heard this before. Billy, what are some of the things that John says are coming for the planet Earth in the next few years to decades?
Well, according to him and his research, and he does stand behind the fact that the sun is the main driver of weather, that the sun is going into a hibernation state, and this will, at the very least, become similar to the Dalton minimum, but may very well be close to the Maunder minimum, which are, two lows in sunspot cycles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If I can read a quote from the Newsmax article. All you have to do is trust natural cycles and follow the facts, and that leads you to the inevitable conclusion that the sun controls the climate and that a new cold era has begun. When you read this article, and we'll have the article linked for you guys, he talks about the fact that not only does the sun control the climate, but this could lead to very significant food shortages that inevitably lead to large-scale famines and social unrest, even riots and chaos. And I would even go a step further and say wars could break out because of this. This is, of course, a position that we've taken for quite some time now. It's part of our climate change, climate change playlist. And this is only a small piece of the puzzle, but we're going to talk about this piece of the puzzle just for a minute here. The Great Lakes didn't completely unfreeze until July of last year. For large parts of the United States, it was one of the worst winters ever. And so far, we have been breaking cold records, breaking snow records here just at the beginning of November. If anybody remembers back on November 1st, they had never seen any snow in this one part of South Carolina in early November. They had never seen any snow of any kind, and they got 16 inches. We haven't broken all-time record lows in this current polar vortex and Arctic blast that we're experiencing in the United States now, but we've broken a lot of monthly lows, and we've broken over 1,000 daily lows. And what that means is, if you're looking at what today's low temperature is, November 20th, you only compare that with the temperature on November 20th of past years, and so we call those a daily record. And we have broken more than 1,000 of those just with this one cold blast that has come through. And we've seen evidence that these polar vortices are really, really driven by lack of solar activity. That is to say, when the sun is less active, we have a better chance of having a polar vortex make things really cold. And Billy, what are the experts saying about solar activity now?
Well, according to three agencies, NASA, the Air Force, and the National Solar Observatory, in 2011 they confirmed this hibernation had begun, and it actually started at the end, the end of the minimum of 2008 into 2009, where we had the lowest recorded minimum, in the past several cycles.
Absolutely. I'm going to type into Google right now, the year without sunspots.
2009.
There we go. I got it. It's an article called "What's Wrong with the Sun." It's on science.nasa.gov. Make that a little bigger. Essentially, in 2008, the sun really kind of dropped down its activity to coincide with the solar minimum of the 11-year cycle. Of course, it didn't end there. In 2009, it went even lower in activity, and then the lead into the current solar maximum, which should have really gotten going around 2010, 2011, didn't really kick in until the end of 2011, and since then has been kind of sputtering on and off, but nowhere near what we should be getting. And just for a little idea here, I'm going to type in solar flare, and I heard a ding there, so let me come back and check on this. Yes, we are screen sharing, presenting to everyone. Billy, did you manage to get on there and see if the screen share was working?
Yeah, okay.
Outstanding. All right, so where are we here? Solar radiation storms, radio blackouts. There we go. Radio blackouts are one of the main things that occur when we get major solar flares. So let's just give an idea of exactly how weak we're doing. X20s are fairly rare. We don't get a ton of them. X10s are fairly powerful. We should get about 8 of these per 11-year solar cycle. We have had none. Our highest flare this cycle, which is about to end, by the way, was an X6.9. Hold your laughter. In terms of X flares in general, we should be getting about 175 per cycle. We haven't even had 50 this cycle. And you can scroll down and, you know, basically in every way imaginable, not only are the sunspots decreasing, but the solar flares are decreasing. The solar wind pressure, the heliospheric pressure is decreasing. CMEs are not delivering geomagnetic storms to Earth. And this is really indicative of what the sun is doing. Now, if I can jump back to the climate issue for a bit, there's another thing here from Newsmax, and it looks like this was probably scanned in. This is called Scientist Confesses, Global Warming, a $22 billion scam. And if I may update this a little bit, we're now closer to being between $27 and $30 billion a year spent on studying global warming. And I'm not going to read all of this, but essentially this talks about how much money is going towards this, and the fact that a lot of it really is political and economic driven, almost to the point where you'd call it greed. You can learn more about John Casey when you're reading this. I really hope the screen share is working, or otherwise it's going to be a little confusing. They go through literally everything that you could want to know about this. And let me scroll down. They talk about the hostile attacks against anybody who would question what's going on right now. And it's not just people like John Casey, who, by the way, is about as top a scientist as you get. But, you know, you had the head of the IPCC, Dr. Pachauri. You had one of the lead authors of the IPCC, Richard Tol, quit in protest. John Coleman, he founded the Weather Channel. He was the first meteorologist on Good Morning America and was the 1982 Meteorologist of the Year, according to the American Meteorological Society. He falls on this side as well, saying that this is a lot of propaganda, if not an outright sham. And he doesn't believe global warming is what they say. You can also look to prominent scientists like Richard McNider and John Christie. John Christie is actually a personal favorite of mine. He's a professor down at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. Some of the charts he has produced were part of a speech I gave at the Electric Universe Conference. These guys both say that, you know, the party line on climate change is dead wrong. Lennart Benson, who is essentially Europe's version of John Coleman, he falls on this side as well. And, you know, we could go on and on. There are tons of people who are sort of jumping ship now that they are really seeing that, you know, things like that alleged consensus on global warming was cherry-picked and then fudged, and that it wasn't really real. They see what is happening to people when they come out against climate change. You can learn more about that in a video I have called Adult Bullies. What you're seeing now is my climate change playlist. Got a bunch of links on there about some interesting stuff. You want to know more about the famines and other stuff we experienced on Earth the last time the sun did what it's doing now. That's the coming solar cycles down there. Just some of the other videos on here, about a 36-minute video. This is taken with parts of my speech from the conference, and some other important points about climate change. Like I mentioned, the video Adult Bullies, that will basically break down how if you are in the IPCC and you don't come to the conclusion they want you to come to, they will threaten your funding and threaten your job. I happen to know this for a fact. I won't mention any names, but some of my friends were actually the grad students and then postdocs that were doing the majority of some of the work for the people who got to actually put their names on these reports. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but when you see a big report like that with a big bolded name up at the top, his underlings usually did a ton of the work. Well, in the case of some of the earlier IPCC reports, some of those folks were my friends, and they were telling me how they were coming to very different conclusions, and they were essentially told that they were going to lose their funding and lose their jobs if they didn't go along with the global warming story. Right below that, we've got a Harvard professor on IPCC and scientific integrity. This is Professor Robert Stavins, and essentially the way this works is, the IPCC comes out with their science, and then they make what's called a summary for policymakers. Well, Robert Stavins is one of the folks who made these summaries, and he said that the policymakers were coming back and telling him what changes to make so that it fit their political propaganda, basically making it the summary by policymakers, not the summary for policymakers. On this playlist, we've got something called Galactic Cosmic Rays, the Cloud Effect, and Impending Surge. With all this controversy in not just climate science, but all kinds of science, one of the things that is least contested is that galactic cosmic rays form abundant cloud cover, and since the clouds on Earth are white, they perfectly reflect light back off into space, just like the ice does at the poles, and this plays an important role in that if we get too many cosmic rays, it'll make too many clouds and that'll reflect too much solar energy, and we could have global cooling. They forgot to mention that extra clouds was the entire premise of the greenhouse effect, and this cosmic ray stuff has completely debunked that, but we'll move on. We do periodic updates of this from time to time. But coming back to what John Casey said, and let me get down to this for a little bit here. I'm looking for the part about earthquakes and volcanoes, and Billy, I'm willing to bet you've got that in your head a little bit better than I'm able to find it here in the article. So why don't you start talking while I look for this?
Well, we do show, according to John's video there, quite a bit of earthquake and volcanic activity do rise during the what he says is the bottom of this ice age event, or mini ice age event. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got it now. He was talking about when New Madrid went off in 1812. That was during the last great solar minimum. It was not a full grand solar minimum, but it was truly a great solar minimum. And one of the things that happens during these solar minima is the coronal holes tend to meander away from the polar regions and get down to be equatorial. And if you know anything about coronal holes, that's where the magnetic fields don't loop back down to the surface like they do in sunspots, but they extend out into space and interact with the interplanetary magnetic field and the planets. And in addition to the fact that these solar grand minima and these great solar minima are proliferative to bigger earthquakes and larger volcanic eruptions, don't forget, we've also got the weakening magnetosphere. So all of these space weather triggers that we've been talking about for a few years that are also proliferative to large earthquakes and volcanic eruptions will be amplified as the magnetosphere decreases in strength, and so it's kind of a little bit of a double whammy there. Um, they go on to talk about a lot of the political stuff involved with this, and the economics that are involved. But essentially, what we have going on here is something that they really distill quite well in this scanned-in article here. And they talk about the 3 blatant lies. Lie number 1 being that the world is getting hotter fast. That's the main party line. That's what you hear in the news. It's what you hear on the media. Well, unfortunately, that's not exactly the case for the last couple of decades. And I'll actually go ahead and pull this up. This is a website you can use to track all of the different folks who track the temperature. On this just here, we've got NASA. We've got 3 different ones from Europe, and we've got one from Michigan State and NOAA. And what these lines are right here, I'll actually make that a little bit bigger. This is basically the last 20 years of the climate. And we've really sort of stopped rising a whole lot, and we've very much plateaued, and depending on which point you pick along this line, we've actually decreased in temperature just a little bit on this planet. Since 1979, the planet has warmed a grand total of 0.36 degrees. I'll say that again. Since 1979, the Earth has warmed 0.36 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that does mean, okay, we are a little bit warmer, aren't we? Well, yes. The problem is that almost all of that warming happened between 1979 and 1998. We've actually been dropping ever since then. This is actually a bit outdated when it says we haven't seen global warming for 17 years. We're technically now approaching a little bit longer than that if you go back past 1998. Here we are, what I was saying before, back in 1998, there was the major El Nino. And since then we've actually gotten colder. But even if you ignore the El Ninos, and I actually like to do that because I actually think it's a little unfair to cherry pick that 1998 point and call us cooling. I don't think you need to do that. It's quite clear that we are on a bit of a cooling trend here, or we have at least plateaued. Lie number 2, the oceans are getting warmer. I'm going to go ahead and just pull up the actual ice caps for us here. This is the NSIDC, the National Snow and Ice Data Center. This data is corroborated by both NOAA and NASA. So, what you're looking at right here, as soon as it pulls up, is the ice extent of the northern hemisphere, the Arctic. And 2012 is this dotted green line right there. And this down here was, for the most part, the lowest on record. Well, look at where we are now in 2014. We are vastly recovered. In fact, for a while, we were approaching the average ice extent over the entire time that we've been monitoring it. So, to make this clear, the ice extent is actually recovering in the Arctic. The northern polar ice is actually increasing after its minimum in 2012. Let's go back here and let's look at Antarctica. Alright, so here the dotted line is 2013. And believe it or not, we spent the majority of 2013 breaking high ice records in Antarctica. And as they're moving into spring and summer in the southern hemisphere, it is dropping off very quickly, especially with a couple of major storms that encroach part of the western sheet and another part. We're now dropping down closer to the satellite average. But this spot right here at its peak was way higher than anything we had ever seen before. Directly below that, the green dotted line was indeed the highest ice extent ever measured in Antarctica. And we were well above that for the better part of a month, actually. So the planet is not warming on land, not warming in the water. Lie number 3. Scientists agree humans are causing global warming fast. And this is what I was talking about before, about this alleged um, consensus. Um, if you want to know more about exactly how that was completely fabricated, they'll talk about it here. I actually want to talk about this gentleman that you see over here right now, Al Gore. You know, I'd like to think that if ClimateGate hadn't been swept under the rug, you know, how they talked about how they were going to fudge the data to erase a cooling trend, and how they were basically going to cherry pick to make it look like global warming was worse than it was. That was the officials basically talking to each other. Now, whoever hacked the emails and stole those emails committed a crime, and that's not good, but still, what it revealed was even worse. But even after ClimateGate, we had still yet to learn of Al Gore's conflict of interest. You know, he was so heavily invested in the organization that would have basically been the major profiteer from trading carbon credits and all this other stuff, would have made him one of the richest men in the world in just a few years. If that's not a conflict of interest, I really don't know what is. Let me get down a little bit further here, because they were talking a little bit about some of the emails that went back and forth. Okay, I've actually found some of those emails from ClimateGate. It was actually 1,000 emails and 2,000 documents. One of the quotes was that the fact is we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it's a travesty we can't. They're talking about how they're going to use something called Mike's nature trick to hide the decline in global temperatures. They're talking about a study by Stephen Goddard from Real Science. His real name is actually Tony Heller, but that's not important. What he did prove, absolutely, was that NOAA and NASA had been adjusting their records by basically fixing when I say fixing, that makes it sound like they made it right. They fixed it so that global warming would be real. And I remember when Tony Heller or Stephen Goddard from Real Science came out with this, and I'm sure many of the observers do too. For 8 days, you could actually go to NASA's website where they had their old chart, pull it up right next to their new one, and see where they fudged the data. It took them 8 days to get rid of that old chart. And still, there has been a real lack of revelation when it comes to this stuff. They go on to talk about Professor Robert Stavins. You'll remember that was the professor from Harvard, professor on IPCC and scientific integrity. Essentially, they lack all of it. This is a terrific article, and they even talk about why the money that is spent on this type of stuff. Essentially, what we've got here is we've got people like John Casey. We've got people like John Coleman and John Christie and Lennart Benson. We've got people like Richard Toll and a couple others just blatantly, just becoming disenchanted with the way the IPCC and this global warming stuff works. And what's really happening is we're seeing them slowly, one by one, lose their fear, jump ship, when they don't have a paycheck to worry about anymore. They will come out and share the truth. You know, the friends that I was talking about before who were working at the IPCC, I know for a fact they needed to take out loans just to go to Penn State. I don't want to know how much they took out for grad school, and they had wives and children at that point. They were not in any kind of position to put their jobs at risk. No kind of position at all. And so here we are, late 2014, about 3 years or so into our questioning of mainstream climate change. And what's the result? Where do we stand right now? Essentially, we've got the media still happily taking their big chunk of that 22 or 27 billion dollars a year. It doesn't cost that much to pay these scientists to do the studies. An enormous amount of that money goes to the media, goes to university programs and local schools. That's why you're only getting one side of the story if that's all you listen to. Well, I suggest that not only you not listen to them, you don't even have to listen to me or John Coleman or John Casey. Just listen to the planet. Billy, describe last winter in Georgia compared to the past couple of decades.
Oh, without a doubt, it was much cooler. The trend
Much cooler?
was totally noticeable. Yeah.
Yeah? I've lost the visual of you there. I just see a black
Oh,
screen.
my camera falling. Falling down.
Come on, show us that pretty face, Billy. Come on. Come on. You already have a real good sounding deep voice. We got to
Thank
see
you to sit up straight.
with it.
Yeah.
So,
On with it.
talk about last winter in Georgia.
Yeah, that was quite cool. I mean, it wasn't, a lot below average, but it was definitely noticeable below average. The summer was also a much milder summer. I may point to note that our 100-degree temperatures, we did not receive nearly the 100-degree temperatures that we have in the past.
There are parts of Texas that counts for as well. There are, of course, a ton of observers that are from Texas, and some of them were even noting that the number of 100-degree days, especially consecutive 100-degree days this summer, was well down from what they've expected or what they've come to expect is normal for that part of the world. If you live anywhere near Detroit or you were there last winter, they were shattering their low temperature records. And I mentioned that just in the last week or so with this current cold blast, we have set more than 1,000 daily records. And I actually think that number was from about 4 days ago. We may be closer to 2,000 daily records set now. But you can actually go to NOAA and look at the daily, the monthly, and the all-time records for the past week, past month so far, the past 365 days, the year thus far. And since 2013, the United States has really been taking a hit on the cold side, much like Europe did a couple of years ago with their winter. Now, because we are still in this climate extreme swings back and forth between hot and cold, while the sun shuts down, because it hasn't quite all the way shut down yet. Europe is right now experiencing much hotter weather than they're used to, but just a few years ago they had more people die in one winter than they have had die in decades, maybe more than 100 years during any winter. It was just that bad. We've already had at least 7 fatalities from the Arctic blast that has come through now. And if we can just talk... What?
I'm sorry. Russia has reported some rough weather, winter-wise.
Absolutely. Russia's been getting, parts of Russia. Far western Russia hasn't been as cold as eastern Russia, but they've also been the victim of some polar vortices. Luckily, not as many people live in Siberia. Let's think a little bit back now, because we've been talking about some of the things that we might expect, some of the things that John Casey said maybe to expect. These are the things that we have been talking about now for years. Not just the fact that we've got bigger volcanoes and major earthquakes set to really go off not too long from now, within the coming years. They may have already even started, as the number of 8 magnitude earthquakes on the planet skyrocketed in the last decade. I mean, absolutely skyrocketed. And yes, our monitoring of earthquakes has gone up, but nowhere near at the rate that we're seeing 8 magnitude earthquakes. So let's just take that out of our minds for a second and think about what is the main sign that we see, or that we should be looking for. Like I said, the Great Lakes didn't really completely unfreeze until July this past summer. What happens when they don't unfreeze until the end of July or August, or if part of it doesn't unfreeze at all. What happens when the snow and ice and record colds that we're having doesn't happen in November? What happens when it's at the beginning of October? Or how about September? Or how about it lasts late May, maybe even into June? There's going to be places where it's not so easy to grow your crops the way you've been used to growing it. I've spoken to some farmers back where my wife and I are from in Columbus, Ohio. They've had to push back, and I understand this is not all of them, but many of them have had to push back their what they consider to be their planting, growing, harvesting by a week. Now I know that doesn't sound like a long time, but in a standardized industry such as agriculture, and that was my wife walking in front of the light, creating an eclipse on me there, which she's going to do again right now. Pregnant with our first child. Hi, baby.
Get away with it.
That's okay. You know, when this happens, to a greater extent, like I said, a week doesn't sound like a lot of time, but in a standardized industry such as agriculture, where they have been doing this for a very long time and they're very good at it, pushing everything back a week is enormous. And this is what we're going to be seeing. I don't think we're more than 5 to 10 years away from a snowstorm that goes from Texas to Canada in the middle of the summertime, destroying billions of dollars worth of crops. Maybe the United States doesn't export food that year. What do you do when we feed the world and we don't export food one year? What do you do when we can't even feed the rapidly growing population of this country? There will be riots, there will be chaos in other parts of the world, and maybe even here there will be wars, there will be major droughts. Some parts will see catastrophic flooding. There will be famine and everything that goes along with it. Disease as well, from malnutrition. The reason, Billy, I dragged you on here, and the reason why I asked everyone to come join us this evening was because we've been slowly watching these folks jump ship, lose their fear of being bullied. I mean, that bullying I was talking about further, you watch that video and you do a little bit of research, you'll find that the number of folks who've not just had their funding or their jobs taken away, but have actually had their families and their own lives threatened over this. It's not just a handful of people. It's a large number of people. And when you've got $27 billion driving something, that's tough to go against, and there are ramifications for going against it. Bad ramifications. But the reason we brought you on here, the reason I wanted you to share some of the stuff that you've been reading about with John Casey, was because John Casey is a name like John Christie, like John Coleman, a lot of Johns, like Lennart Benson, like Robert Stavins. I mean, Robert Stavins is from Harvard, questioning the IPCC's scientific integrity. A couple folks from Yale came out and outright asked if the IPCC had completely outlived its usefulness. Scafetta, Dr. Scafetta from Duke University. I don't play around there either. It's actually not too far away from where I was today in Raleigh. He's on point with this stuff as well. And if you go back to that climate change playlist, which will be linked there, I've got some names and some credentials on that list that would should really make you at least think about this, especially because this isn't the antithesis of what we've been hearing from the global warming side. On one hand, you've got the global warmists, and I don't know if YouTube mirrors it, but this is my left hand, so it's appropriate. A global warming story is that humans are the cause of all of this. We're killing the planet, and something needs to change. We're getting warmer really fast. Well, that might not be so true. On the other hand, you've got Sorry, Mr. Moncton. You've got folks that are using that 20-year lack of global warming to suggest things like, oh, see, climate change isn't a problem. We shouldn't be regulating these polluters. Well, climate change is a big problem. And I can think of half a dozen reasons to regulate polluters or want to decrease pollution. I've got some people very close to me who are strongly affected by aerosol pollution and other things like that. I'm not just talking respiratory, central nervous system, endocrine system. I've got reasons for you to stop polluting all day. It's just that when it comes to the climate, we need to be looking a little bit beyond that. I even agree with the position over here that we need to, I obviously agree that we need to stop polluting and that people need to change. I mean, think about how wasteful we are. We don't live sustainably. We're really not in tune with the planet. I agree with a lot of that stuff. And Billy, you and I have had this conversation where, let's say there was no climate change whatsoever. I might even be able to forgive them for this lie of straight global warming if indeed it was going to get people to change. The problem is that we are sacrificing the truth, and there is a far more dangerous aspect to climate change that is absolutely real, and it's on our doorstep.
Mm-hmm.
Not in 100 years, not in 50 years. This is now, right now. Billy, what were the groups that you said confirmed that the solar hibernation has begun?
Yeah, well, NASA, the United States Air Force, and the National Solar Observatory, all confirmed.
Yeah. The National Solar Observatory, for those who don't know, they're the ones who run Gong H Alpha and all the other stuff from Gong. They picture NASA-level scientists, but all they care about is the sun, pretty much. Two of their best, Penn and Livingston, had questioned whether or not the coming solar cycle will have any sunspots at all. That's pretty serious. There's a 2006 article from NASA that says that the coming solar cycle we're going to have next could be the weakest in hundreds of years. Where have we heard that before? It's pretty clear that with this much money behind the story, and with as many gullible people on this planet as there are, they're not going to stop. I mean, you're talking about an industry that would dwarf most companies that are on any stock exchange. Not all. Not all companies, but this would be a major player, one of the major players on any stock exchange with the amount of money that goes to this each year. You're not going to stop that train.
It is incredible to watch. I mean, like we talk about all the time, don't listen to what they say, but watch what they do. And if you look at what Obama just signed with the Chinese government over the climate issue recently, I think last week, they gave China the ultimatum. They need to have all their carbon peak within the next 30 years. In other words, they need to build and produce their peak amount of carbon by 2030, not 30 years, 15 years. So, I mean, that's like, go out now and make as much as you possibly can, which is opposite of what you would suggest in a situation as that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible to see what's going on. John Casey, again, he has said in his interviews that he has confronted the executive branch government through 2 administrations on this particular issue with solar-driven weather, and they just completely ignore it.
Yeah,
I mean,
he had a little bit more luck with Bush, didn't he?
yeah,
Than
according to him, he did, yeah. But I mean,
oh,
not only are we not preparing for what's coming, but we're actually going in the opposite direction
exactly.
under this false pretense, you know.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense that he would have a little bit more luck with Bush, given the oil connection there and the fact that they love the idea. And
I hate to go there, and this is not something John Casey says, but I mean, man, if you really look into it, that right now, today, there are 1.1 million active wellheads on the planet. If this is, according to John Casey, one of their theories is the mantle may be experiencing some changes, which creates more pressure underneath the crust. And if this is the case, and any of the theories that would be in this case would suggest that we have definitely, by some means, relieved quite a bit of pressure over the past 100 years.
no, yeah, absolutely. We've talked about that a
So
number
we
of
don't
times.
really know whether we have done good or bad or what, you know, really. We know
Yeah,
so
well, I mean,
little. It's pathetic
yeah,
how little we really know, you know.
yeah, well, I mean, we talk about that a lot on our weekly podcast, and I'll just do a quick little tangent there. A good example of that would be, um, one of the largest tar volcanoes in the world is in the Gulf of Mexico, and there was a lot of worry it was going to blow, a lot of quiet worry that it was going to blow until somebody drilled a hole into it and relieved a bunch of pressure.
Too
But
low,
that's another story for another day.
too low,
You're right, twice.
too
But
relieved.
it's tough, and we've even held attacks. We've even been hit with attacks on this stuff as well. I mean, literally, I've started videos, probably a dozen videos, with my position on pollution, and I still get called an oil boy. It's ridiculous.
Now,
But you can understand why Casey might have had a little bit easier a time with Bush than with Obama. But so I think it's quite clear that until it starts snowing in Miami, they're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing this. And your friends, I'm talking to the observers now, your friends and family who are head over heels with this global warming thing, you have no chance of convincing them. Even if you show them the stuff from John Coleman and John Casey, and you use all the tools that I've given you in that climate change playlist. Remember, all the links are always there. You have virtually no chance of convincing these people what's going to happen. The only person whose life you can affect, really, is yours and your families. When these polar vortices really get going in January and February, that -30, -40, -50 won't just be confined to the U.S.-Canada border. That's coming way south.
yeah,
It won't get all the way to the Gulf, but it'll still be -10 with a foot of snow or ice. When you guys get snow and ice down south, it shuts the city down.
mm-hmm.
I mean, can you imagine you get an ice storm, knocks out power, and if it's a bad enough one, they're not getting out there to fix it for maybe weeks. And you've got a polar vortex where it doesn't get above 0 degrees Fahrenheit for days on end. You get some days that are -10. There are a lot of people in the Gulf states that don't even have heat. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. Buffalo, New York, and places in the Northeast and the Midwest, we're used to snow. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I didn't move very far away to Columbus, Ohio. I know snow. I know cold. But what's been happening there, with people dying like this, and these records falling in the middle of November, this is a very bad sign, not just for the next 30 years or the next decade. That's a really bad sign for this winter. This could end up being one of the worst winters in the history of the East Coast of the United States. To be honest, looking at some of the upper scale patterns, I think the western part of the United States is probably going to escape that for the most part. Those lows just get stuck in the armpit of Alaska and they yank up from the south so hard. They're yanking up from Baja. They're bringing that air north. Just ask some folks in Alaska how warm it's been at times over the last couple of years. Last 2 years, basically. But essentially,
that's the
the
bad thing
story.
about it. We're not looking at just one winter. We're
Yeah,
looking at several winters for the next several years, and at a minimum, according to John Casey, we're looking at a Dalton minimum, which
yeah,
is around 10, 15 possible years.
yeah. There's there are probably 4 or 5 different cycles you can look at, and there are 10 or 12 different prominent agencies you can look at, and when you put all this stuff together, it really suggests that this pause isn't so much of a pause, that it's the plateau, and we're going to start going down, along with the sun, which has already started to weaken. This has been one of the most pitiful solar maximums you could ever really imagine. And if it does go into a Dalton or a grand minimum,
Hmm.
then we really do have another mini ice age situation. It's important you hear the word mini in front of that.
Looking at the 100,000 year data, I know we probably get into this some other time, but it does appear that this is the longest duration of warming over
Oh,
the past
absolutely. We
half
are
million
way
years or
overdue
so.
for an ice age.
Absolutely.
We are way
According to
overdue.
the data.
You're talking about the 400-year
Right.
ice core data where it compares
We
temperature to
have these,
CO2.
right, CO2 temperature, right. Yeah, and we have these spikes in warming that don't last
Absolutely.
but just a few thousand years, and they could drop right
Correct.
off.
For
The
those
one
who
we're in now currently has had a much larger duration than any of the previous.
Absolutely. And
So
for observers, if you need your memory jogged on this a little bit, that's the Vostok
that's
ice
it.
core data,
About
which we've shown a number of times, and I'm sure you can remember it if you've seen the videos. If not, go and watch the climate change playlist. You don't have to believe it. Just
mm-mm.
at least be aware of it so you're not completely shocked when this actually happens. Um, but yeah, so the message really is that no, we're probably not going to get the world to do a 180 on this. They're not going to admit that they were wrong. They've got too much invested at this point to turn back now. But this isn't just about who is right. This, in many situations, will be about survival. Whether you're trying to deal with negative 50 degrees in Wisconsin, or you're just trying to deal with -4 or -5 for days on end in southern Louisiana, and you don't have any heat, you don't have any power. Your phone doesn't work, you can't call for help, you can't take the car out and go anywhere. Nobody can get to you. You've got to survive on what's in your house. And in the near short term, meaning this winter, it's going to be hitting the east coast of the United States, back to the center, and maybe I would say, I shouldn't even call it the east coast. I should call it the eastern half of the United States. We'll be getting it worse, but when this actually happens the way it really looks like it's going to happen, preparation in some form or fashion will likely be the difference between who lives and who dies.
Yeah.
I mean, it's terrible that 7 people have died in this current polar vortex. But if I may state it in this way, that's nothing. This is only the beginning. This polar vortex we've seen here in November, this is just an appetizer. Wait until it's February or January and this is happening. And the temperatures are 10 to 15 degrees colder. And there's 30% more snow. And power goes down. Wait until the Great Lakes stay frozen, at least partially frozen, for an entire year and see how cold that summer is. We have a lot of resources here. And like I said, it's really going to be on you and your family for this. Because when it comes to the larger picture of things, we are all kind of on our own. And that's the cold truth of it all. So as long as the universe permits it, I'll still be doing the news every morning. Billy, you'll still be joining me every Saturday morning for our podcasts on Fly on the Wall. And any new breaking updates, we'll be sure to give them. Right, Billy?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. We really appreciate it. Eyes open.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Be safe, everyone.